Hello and welcome to the British Society of Magazine Editors panel on how to discuss trans issues in the media. My name is Cliff Joannou and I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Attitude magazine, one of the world's biggest LGBTQ+ media brands. In recent years, everybody seems to have an opinion on how trans people should live their lives. Newspaper and magazine writers, journalists, columnists, many of whom count all of zero trans people amongst their network of friends and colleagues, seem to have an opinion on the topic. Meanwhile, an immense amount of coverage is given over to discuss it in quite vitriolic detail how trans people, who constitute around 0.2% of the UK population, should live their lives. It's no surprise that in last week's British Social Attitude Survey, the proportion of people that characterise themselves as not at all prejudiced against people who are transgender has fallen from 82% to 64% since 2019. When the world seems to have an opinion on a community they have more often than not never engaged with, we thought we should ask the people that know best how to talk about trans issues in the media. And that's three trans people working in the media. So without further ado, please meet our panel. First, Nick.
Hi, my name's Nick. I'm the Deputy Editor at Diva, the world's leading magazine for LGBTQIA women and non-binary people, and my pronouns are they, them.
Hi everyone, I'm Fox Fisher and my pronouns are he or they. I'm an artist, author, filmmaker, trans campaigner. I've written for iNews, The Independent, Metro, The Guardian. I had a column in Gay Times for a hot minute and I did my first work experience at Diva magazine, actually. I helped to set up My Generation, which helps, it works with film to help change hearts and minds about trans issues. And I have 4 books, one which is really hated by the Daily Mail, which I gifted to Piers Morgan live on television. And I was born in London and I live in Brighton with my partner who identifies as non-binary as well, and 3 cats and our pointy dog.
My name's Jess. I'm a senior reporter for Pulse, which is a magazine for GPs. I write for its supplements and its sister title, Healthcare Leader.
Thank you, everybody. Fox, I'm going to insist that we see your cats at some point. So first question to the panel, let's perhaps go to Fox first. What was trans representation in the media like when you were growing up?
Oh my goodness, it was absolutely non-existent. I think on my visit I used to go over to San Francisco because they seemed to have a more developed LGBT scene at the time. And I remember on one of my visits to San Francisco in about 2009, I was talking with my friend Amos Mack, who ended up setting up Original Plumbing magazine, which it was an instant hit on the queer and trans scene. This was about 3 years before I started my own transition, and this magazine, it helped me to see people like myself not only represented but also celebrated. So I'm kind of with the ethos, if you don't see it, you have to make it yourself. So I was really proud of my friend Amos for setting that up.
And Nick?
Yeah, similar to Fox, it feels to me that it was almost non-existent. Like I don't remember reading the word trans until I was quite way into my teens. And then by the time I was in my 20s, there was a lot of the scaremongering that we see today, sadly.
What was your representation like, Jess?
Yeah, so I think similar, but I think growing up in the 2010s, I think it's also important to sort of address this idea that there was a sense of inevitable kind of progress with LGBT rights. Like at the start of the decade, you had marriage equality, and then in the sort of years after, you had, the first trans pride and the Women Equalities Committee inquiry into trans equality in 2015, which worked out great. I think at that point, we had a lot of visibility without the sort of consequences of visibility, which is, of course, violence and vitriol, which is what we're now living through. So I think that's completely undone, that kind of naive thought that progress is easily sort of attained when it's obviously hard won. But
did you feel things are better or worse for trans visibility today?
better or what? I mean, worse, like absolutely worse. I mean, by any metric. I mean, you pointed to the 2023 British Attitude Survey, which obviously saw a drop in people who identify as not prejudiced from 82% to 64% between 2019 and 2022, which is it's like 18 percentage points. That's nuts. And that leaves like 3 in 10 people who are a little prejudiced, and the rest who presumably feel very prejudiced, I think is the term that they take their name against. So that's encouraging. And then also that same survey found obviously that the number of people who support the idea that trans people should be able to amend their birth certificate dropped from 53% in 2019 to 30%. And this is from a country that's, you know, it loves to say I'm not racist, but I'm not homophobic, but, and it's very good at sort of obfuscating its bigotry. So the fact that fewer people are disguising that kind of prejudice towards trans people is alarming and says quite a lot.
Fox, what do you think has changed in the last few years?
Well, I mean, if we think about 10 years ago in 2013, the waiting lists, I guess, were less, and language was a little bit clunky. We're still learning certain terms. People did seem to be more willing to learn about trans issues, but I think 2015 we had what we consider the tipping point with Laverne Cox on the front cover of Time magazine and so on. And I think at that point we kind of felt like things were going to be getting a lot easier and a lot better, and we were winning in some way with definitely social awareness. But there has been such a rise in negative articles on trans issues, which are completely disproportionate to the trans population, which is probably less than 1%. I saw, thanks to Helen Weberly, I saw something online about in January of 2013, apparently the Daily Mail posted 6 articles about trans issues and none of them were negative. And then in January 2023, they posted 115 articles and 87% of those articles were negative about trans people. If we look at 2018, 1,700 anti-trans hate crimes were reported, apparently. And in just 4 years since 2018, it's increased by about 156% to 4,300 anti-trans hate crimes in 2022. So things are not looking good. And yeah, we're kind of in a bit of a mess at the moment, I think, fueled by the negative media.
Nick, what do you see as directing this anti-trans rhetoric that's taken off in the last few years? What do you see as fueled this anti-trans rhetoric that's certainly taken grip over the last few years?
Yeah, so a bit like what Jess said and what Fox has said, we did have like the increased visibility. So it was 10 years ago that Orange is the New Black came out and Laverne Cox was on there, and, you know, people were very hopeful. You know, I've spoken to trans and non-binary people who, when the show was coming out, they were like so optimistic for the potential. Everything seemed like it was going to get better, and unfortunately it got worse. And we do unfortunately see this with marginalized groups, is that often when there is increased visibility, there is often the downside, which is more attack, more, as we've seen, anti-trans rhetoric and more attack on rights.
Do you think that it's a case of the issue is quite clickbaity, and obviously that drives traffic and then that drives revenue? So are trans people being used?
100%.
Yeah. And how does that make you feel as a trans person?
Dehumanized, and it will be, I think it truly will be a horrifying moment, and yeah, it'll be shameful when we look back in this.
Yeah.
And there's a common thread that happens where trans people's bodies are often discussed quite openly in the media. What's it like to read about the policing of trans people's bodies so often in the press, Jess?
I mean, it's horrible. Obviously, it's a sad question. I think to keep on track with the learning lessons today, I think it's encouraging that to know that here is being handed to us such a convincing and abundant body of evidence that trans women, trans people, and cis women face very similar threats. I think I've found personally that pointing to that kind of discussion about trans bodies to be such an effective way of helping cis women understand what it's like to be seen as trans, because cis women have obviously been policed for basically ever in the exact same way as trans people, right? And for the same reasons, like here's someone telling you what you can do with your body. If you want to get by with the gender, then you've got to look a certain way, you've got to do everything a certain way, and you've got to do it by the due processes that obviously weren't designed to help you because they're sexist or transphobic or whatever. And without getting or like Barbie movie about it, you know, cis women have to do womanhood perfectly, and trans women shouldn't even try. Is basically what we're told. And I think it doesn't have to be any more complex than the fact that a lot of cis women want to be better allies to trans people and don't know how. And I think it's by paying attention to that specific aspect of transphobia in the media, in the press. It just happens to be the perfect kind of common ground, which obviously isn't what the people writing it want, but that doesn't matter.
I think the British Social Attitude Survey as well pointed that generally more men are anti-trans than females as well, which is an interesting statistic to see.
Yeah. What's interesting is that it's always been higher among women who are cis compared to men who are cis. And support that is. But interestingly, in the 2023 survey, they said its support is down across all categories and all cohorts, which is, I think, just not exactly surprising.
Fox, as a trans man, how do you relate to that idea that, you know, trans people's bodies are often discussed so openly and freely by people who have no relationship or interaction with trans people?
It seems pretty bizarre to me, really, that people are so fascinated and obsessed with trans people and their bodies and what we do with ourselves in order to feel more comfortable in our own skin. It's also interesting in the media how certain trans people and their stories are pushed to the forefront because they're more conforming and more acceptable to people, you know. And I think that's really interesting because there's still this gatekeeping that happens even when we are looking at trans bodies. And I mean, for me, it's exhausting being on the defensive, because often when trans bodies are being discussed, or some topic crops up like that, it's, you know, they're often wanting comments from people like myself or other people, and it can feel really, really frustrating because there's so much fear mongering and misinformation, and it has this trickle down effect on people when that happens. And we already have such a negative body image generally about ourselves. You know, I know I had to go through that process. I had to wade through so much guilt and shame in order to come out as trans and be who I am, and to finally be in a position to help other people. So yeah, it's hard because it's like you're already giving yourself such a hard time, and then you look in the media and people are judging you on top of that. So it's kind of a layered thing.
Nick?
Yeah, it feels like there's almost no escape from this concentration on bodies in particular. Like even when something's celebratory, like most recently, the 4th season of Sex Education came out, which is like this glorious representation. You know, it was like relieving. There was so much positive press about it, but then there was also press that was so hyper focused on like how a show could, show gender affirming scars and stuff like that. And again, just this hyper focus on trans bodies in a negative light, and something that shouldn't. Yeah, it should have just been very celebratory, and unfortunately it wasn't.
So what are the common stereotypes and pitfalls that editors can easily avoid when talking about trans people? Jess, do you want to open?
Yeah, I mean, common pitfalls. I think that a good blanket statement, just a good rule for anyone, is to be aware that a lot of trans people probably won't want to talk to you if you're a journalist, and if you can't get a trans perspective for a story that probably needs one, then maybe don't run the story. I think it's quite a testament to the damage our industry's done to the trust that trans people might have had in journalism, that many just won't talk to us at all. Even if you're a trans journalist like I am, people still, that's not encouraging enough. That's not enough to sort of repair any kind of trust that's been lost. That's kind of the first rule. I guess another one would be knowing where to draw a line between what's a story for trans people and what's a story about trans people with wider public interest. Like I've pitched stories before that are about, trans experiences that only trans people are really going to face and probably find interesting. And they've been rejected because they're not relatively accessible for cis people, and that's fine because most of the people reading are going to be cis. But then there are issues like trans healthcare and the NHS in particular, which are trans problems. They affect trans people only, but they're important for cis people to know about because there is obviously value in cis people knowing that, because it's, the more people are aware about it, the larger the audience is, simply that. And I guess as well, considering that trans people is quite a large group, and that if you're commissioning stories about trans people, maybe specify if you're talking about trans men, non-binary people, trans women, and commission accordingly.
Yeah, it's often the case, isn't it, when you get panels on television or articles and there is no trans voice and they're talking about it. It's almost like, talking about the Black community without going to a Black person for their voice, or discussing women's issues without even speaking to a woman about it. It often shocks me. Nick, what kind of stereotypes or tropes do you want to bust right here, right now, with all our editors listening?
Well, firstly, there's so many statistics and stereotypes, and people need to be really careful when reporting on any marginalized group, because they could be adding so much fuel to a fire that already exists. And we know that it's been reported that the way the media discusses trans lives, it directly impacts how trans people are treated, both by strangers on the street as well as their families. So for editors and writers who are wanting to do better for the trans community, there's an organisation called Trans Media Watch, which offers guidance for outlets wanting to get it right. And I'd highly recommend fully reading the resources on their website. And they go into great detail again about how you can avoid adding to stereotypes and such as that for reporting.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Nick. That's actually a really useful resource to share. Do you want to pop that into the chat just for people to find?
Oh, yeah.
Fox, what's your big bugbear when it comes to stereotypes and tropes?
That's I've got a few for sure. Just with that in mind, from what Nick just mentioned, it might also be worth checking out All About Trans. I think it's allabouttrans.org, and they've been working for the past 12 years, I'd say 11 or 12 years, on going into either magazines, newspapers, any part of the media, and just bringing trans people with them to have conversations with people in the companies. So they really are doing great work, and they've done lots of great work behind the scenes. So definitely one to get in touch with if you're thinking about holding an interaction at your workplace. They're the ones that can help facilitate that. So yeah, I guess some of the common stereotypes that people can try and avoid. I guess if you got to the point of writing an article about a trans person or a trans issue, then it seems so simple, but misgendering, just be aware of what pronouns that person uses, because it's just a sign of respect, and it can be quite jarring or strange if you're not using the right pronouns for somebody. Just try and avoid being sensationalistic, sensationalizing things about trans people and their experiences, because trans people they're not a trend, they're not a topic for controversy, and they're just individuals with stories. So they should be portrayed that way. If you're focusing on someone's transition, just ask yourself, is their trans experience important in this story? Is there anything to do with what you're writing about? Because it's kind of alarming sometimes how much they include about a trans person's experience when it's not about that at all. So it can be included for sure, because it's part of someone's identity and personality, but it shouldn't be, in the headline, or for example, or and just be cautious of that. And I guess also realizing that trans people, like it's not a mental health issue or a disorder. Being trans isn't something that needs to be cured or fixed or anything like that. It's really an integral part of someone's identity. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So when an editor does decide to commission a piece and is concerned about the social media flurry that will come inevitably from either their readers or outside sources, what kind of hints and tips would you advise people follow in order to manage the social media storm that could follow? Fox, really good.
I think there's a lot you can do, and I think it's about, if you're writing about someone, it's about protecting that person. So you know, don't just drop that person as soon as you've got their wording. You know, first and foremost, you might want to it'd be respectful to be able to share the wording with the person that you're writing about. I know that often headlines and the wording that you put next to a photograph isn't often shared with someone, but you know, those little details, it's really important to share that, because often I've been in the case where I've shared words and then I've seen this sensationalistic kind of headline that hasn't really been accurate or representative. So let those trans people help you to create that stuff as well. And also, if you're creating an article that is potentially going to have some pushback and you want to be able to protect that trans person, maybe consider turning the comments off, or follow up and just see how that trans person is doing as well after the article, and say, you know, how you're feeling and is there anything I can do for you? Because that kind of act of care really means a lot, and often people, by putting themselves into the media, by having a voice as such, can cause all sorts of problems and issues. You know, not a day has gone by in the past 12 years of me being out as a trans person and doing the type of campaigning work that I do. I've received hate messages every single day online. There's not one day that's gone by where I haven't received that, and that's not like me getting out my violin or anything, because I've got tough skin. There's nothing they can say that I haven't heard before, but there's often people who aren't as tough as me that are putting themselves out there, and I feel like they're quite vulnerable people in some ways, you know, and it's just really important to follow up with that. So don't be afraid of writing about trans issues, but do try and support those trans people that you're writing about.
I mean, you talk about compassion really there, aren't you?
Yeah.
Nick, how do you manage the stories on Diva? Because I'm sure there can be some issues there as well.
Yeah, it definitely, yeah, it's very sad that, especially with the world of online, anyone can have their say, even if they're not like a reader of Diva, they sometimes find us, and it's just disheartening to see. But I think at Diva, we're like very firm on what our values are. You know, we're always like Diva with the T, and we always stand up in trans solidarity. So, and what we actually see is that like people who actually follow us and obviously subscribe to us, they're all for that message. Otherwise they wouldn't be subscribing to our magazine, because we're consistently trans inclusive. But yeah, when it comes to like the world of online and social media, it's important to try and just to be consistent, and also like delete hateful comments and stuff and stay on top of that, such as that, or mute it, like Fox said.
Are there examples of that you've had to face, Jess, in terms of kickback from when you've published articles on social media?
Not so much on social. I don't really use a lot of social media, so not so much. But I think, you know, I think in terms of that kind of vitriol and avoiding it, I think, you know, the trick is to just do your own research. I think that's the simple answer, right? I think, you know, don't use news stories to research anything. Don't use tweets that people are talking about as a news hook on a trans story, especially. I think, you know, there's always that point when you're writing a story and you just get some background info in there or some stats or something. You don't want to be going in shorthands on that. You want to be pulling things from, you know, the data set or the document. You don't want to be, you know, running on someone else's turn of phrase or sleight of hand. And if, you know, I think if you're coming at it from the right perspective, which is, you know, relatively positive, or at least neutrally, you know, a neutral perspective on trans people, you know, you don't want to be regurgitating anything that might any phrase that might be used to sort of imply something that might not actually be the case. Because as you asked about my job, like I report on a lot of NHS policy documents, and what's written and how it's presented, they're like night and day. Sometimes, what's in a document and what's actually quoted and how it's phrased is it's like two different stories. It's two different sources. That raises concerns as to the veracity of the coverage.
It's interesting what you said, actually, Jess, about you not being on social media as well. And I know lots of my trans friends who work in the media actively don't use social media for that reason. It's quite horrible to think that your very existence means that you can't access these common platforms that we all take for granted. Like Fox, I know that you endured some pretty horrific moments a few years ago when you had to leave your publisher, actually. So can you share what happened in your own words and how you managed the mental health fallout from that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this was a few years ago. My partner, Owl, and I were with a publisher that was ended up being acquired by another publisher called the Blair Partnership, and we were initially, literary agency. So we were super excited about that because it was the same literary agency as J.K. Rowling. But we soon enough noticed that J.K. was making some strange comments which seemed ill-informed about trans people, about trans issues. So we noticed that her comments were getting worse, and we reached out to our literary agency and just to see how they could manage her and us at the same time, because it seemed we're quite opposing views, and we weren't sure how supported we'd be within the literary agency because of that. And so they didn't reply to us. They didn't respond to us at all. So our only option really was to do an open letter, and myself, my partner, and another author with that agency decided to leave. And because of that, it was very, it's kind of like a David and Goliath situation, and JK is like one of the biggest authors ever. And she has millions and millions of followers. And that was one of the days, there's been a few days throughout the past, 10, 12 years where I received, thousands and thousands and thousands of comments of hate from people on all platforms, mostly Twitter. And it was just rubbish, but it did have an effect on my mental health, and it did affect myself and my partner. And we were worried that no one would want to touch us because we were seen as troublemakers. We were worried that we wouldn't be able to find another agent and that we wouldn't be able to publish anything in the future. But we risked all that because we just couldn't stay in a place where we felt uncomfortable. And so often this is the case where you're given a platform, but it means you have to debate debate with someone who doesn't feel that you have the right to exist, or so it's pretty rare to be given a platform like this, for example, where it's a safer space and we're able to speak openly about trans issues without someone coming in and giving their ill-informed opinion about it.
Yeah, I think it's really important to talk about all the different parts of ourselves that make up who we are. Like you said, you're an author, but then also you had to stand by your identity as a trans person and do the right thing and leave the agency. Nick, as well, you mentioned before about all the different parts of your identity, and I know you're quite passionate about speaking intersectional identities that come with being a trans person. You're not just a trans person, you're so many other things. And I think it's important that we recognize that.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I feel, as you say, many things. I'm Black, I'm mixed race, I'm, trans, non-binary, I'm gay. There's so many other aspects to my identity outside of like the groups that I belong to. They do all intersect, and I think it's important that we, when we're talking about trans people, we're not a monolith. I'm just one person. Everyone on this panel has so many different lived experiences and perspectives, and working at Diva, we are an LGBTQIA publication. So as part of that, we try to be as intersectional as possible. And so again, we don't just tell one story. We look at all the different experiences. Me and our editor-in-chief, Roxy, we work very closely on this. And it means a lot to us and the entire team as well.
Jess as well. I mean, I think it's wonderful to see a trans person not working in a field that one usually sees trans people working in. So what were your experiences entering the medical field there?
You know, pretty regular. I think there's sort of, you know, there are times obviously when transness and medicine do overlap. Obviously not everyone who transitions does so with prescriptions or surgeries or anything, but sometimes they do. And one of the big talking points at the moment, of the many we've got going on, is trans NHS waiting lists. And you know, it can sort of be a bit you know, when you fall into two categories, journalist and trans person, the lack of bias, or the bias, people tend to question it, which I don't think is fair, because I can do my job. But you know, there are times when you sort of raise a story about, I should say not recently, this doesn't happen where I currently work, but you know, there have been times where you raise a story and it gets sort of kicked down the road a bit, because, you know, can you actually do this properly, and can you do this professionally, which I think is quite an insulting kind of way to look at how I can do my job. I think you know, it's like asking a cis woman if they can write about anything that affects a cis woman. Of course they can, and if you were to question that, that would be rightly seen as very sexist. And I think transness, I think in the case of transness specifically, people tend to forget, as Nick touched on, that there are multiple aspects to who they are, and there's no one characteristic that's inevitably going to define them, and certainly not how well they can do their job, I think.
Nick, do you ever have to feel you have to pick one part of your identity over others in order to placate people, or?
Yeah, I think that people who with intersectional identities can often feel this pressure, but yeah, it's all about you're a full person, and I feel that people should be able to be their full selves without having to give prominence to one.
I like how it's like so wonderful to see that trans people can also be wonderful writers. They can be editors and photographers, and they can work in any field. So how do we stop the media just seeing trans people purely through the lens of their transness? Fox?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. Because we are so much more than that. I guess that with editors, there is a fear, isn't there, of getting things wrong. And because of that fear, they might just leave something alone altogether and not want to go there. But editors do have a massive power to change hearts and minds. So yeah, I think I don't know, it's so important for editors just to utilize their power to help to make those changes. Ask me the question again, please.
Well, I guess what we don't see enough of is a trans person in a story, say, about looking at someone's beautiful interiors of their home, and they happen to be a trans person. You know, they're always, trans people's stories always seem to be told through the lens of them being a trans person. Yeah, it's always exactly the politics of being a trans person in society. They can't just be a person that seems to be in an editorial conversation about something else, you know, about cooking, or just like, you know, or just everyday mundane things. Like you said, you live in Brighton with your partner with 2 cats. You know, trans people live lives and do quite ordinary, boring things most of the time.
Exactly. And that's it, you know, that's kind of the mission, to help people to understand that trans people are just people that have these intersections, that, you know, have different interests and passions. And we've got all of these different aspects to ourselves where we can connect. And it, you know, you might not understand what it is to be trans, but you might also have a dog, you know. So it is, you know, really important to be able to recognize that we are, you know, many multi-layered thing. And you know, for example, my friend was on MasterChef, and they never mentioned that he was a trans guy. And I think maybe they missed a trick. It's a delicate balance, isn't it? Because you kind of, you want to raise attention to someone being trans, just to help people to understand that we're everywhere, and we live amongst you, and we've been part of society for forever. And then on the other side, you don't want to make a big deal of it as well, you know, and have it all about being trans. So it is a fine line, but I think that people can discern that based on what they're writing about and who they're writing about.
I mean, I think from me as a cis gay queer man, like, I love it when I see myself in that through that lens, just reflected, just I'm part of the story. You know, that person being gay or queer is not intrinsic to the storyline. It's not about their struggle. It's not about them, you know, the politics of their body and their sexuality or identity. They just happen to be in that story for who they are. And I think we could do with seeing more of that. Because it also leads into something that I know we're all, or definitely you guys are all passionate about talking about, and we try to do with Attitude, is talk about trans joy. Because often, like I just said, like with the media, it tends to focus on the angry politics of it. So just recently, I remember Glamour magazine had this fabulous cover with Logan Brown, and that image of that pregnant trans man on the cover was so powerful and carries such an instant recognizable message of, like, this is a person we're celebrating. Do you feel the media needs to, you know, how does the media celebrate trans joy more? Nick?
Yes, excellent point. And you know, as we said earlier, I feel like there's not that much focus on trans joy at the moment, because, as we said earlier, like the trans debate at you know, editors would be interested in like the clicks, and sadly, but I think that we get more trans joy by thinking, just because a story you know, is about a trans person or is about trans people, it doesn't have to be a story about pain and fear. We experience love and joy just like everyone else. With that said, though, I would say that, like, I think we need to stop pressuring people to write certain types of stories. So there needs to be room for both. So at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, there was a lot of pressure put on Black writers to tell stories about joy instead of oppression. And I think there needs to be room for marginalized people to authentically express themselves in whichever way is authentic to them.
What does trans joy mean to you, Jess?
I think it's interesting. I think, you know, I think it's twofold. I think the people who stand to benefit most from stories about trans people living happy and successful lives are probably young people, right? Like young queer people who probably don't see that in their immediate personal life. And I think one of the reasons we probably don't read much about trans joy is because if it's for that audience, we really don't make a lot of journalism for young people in this country. We make a lot of magazines for kids under 13, and everything else we write is for adults. So there is kind of that sort of oversight in regards to those young people who could probably benefit a lot from that kind of story. I think that's a significant factor in why we don't have more positive trans stories. I think, you know, Pink News, Gay Times, Diva do go a long way to sort of bridge that gap. I think the second fold, I guess, is sort of about the fact that sort of transition is the moneymaker. I think historically it's been what sells, and, you know, people love to ask, you know, did transition liberate you? Do you feel better for it? And, you know, it's a question that most people are going to be asked. And I think transition is a very positive thing, but it's also very administrative. It's very bureaucratic, and, you know, most of the joy, the best parts come after that, right? Like, but that's not really what commissioners seem to be interested in. And historically, I don't think that's the case either. I mean, from the earliest days of trans visibility, it's been, you know, memoir is sort of the definitive way talking about transness, even in journalism. I mean, there's the classic headline, XGI becomes blonde beauty, I think is the alliterative terms they use. And that's from the 40s. And that was an article telling the story of Christine Jorgensen, who, you know, was a World War II vet, came back and transitioned. It was the first US trans person to gain celebrity status just through virtue of transition. And we see that all the time through, you know, British journalism as well, like the BBC Two documentary in the 70s about Julia Grant. You know, it's kind of the approach is the medical marvel of transition, and the act of transitioning is the bit that people want to read about. It's not a prison of our own making. Obviously, it's just the walls have been put up around us, and you know, you can stick your head above the parapet where you can. And there's obviously huge value to memoir because these are stories that don't otherwise get told. But it has become definitive, and I think it does ice out a lot of other trans experiences, like just living your life and the things that might happen until you die.
So are there any examples of positive trans representation that you've seen recently that you wanted to highlight? Fox?
Yeah, sure. Just thinking, I mean, this year at Trans Pride in Brighton, we celebrated 10 years of Trans Pride, and that's with 30,000 people marching for trans rights, and that wasn't reported really in the mainstream media at all. So it is really important to have these moments of trans inclusivity and celebrations, like you said about Logan Brown being on the front cover of Glamour magazine, and as I mentioned earlier, Laverne Cox on Time magazine. But that was a while ago, I suppose. In fairly recent years, I guess the first major thing was Paris Lees being on the front cover of Vogue magazine in 2018, which was a really iconic moment. And do you remember National Geographic? They had a special issue called Gender Revolution in 2017, which highlighted stories of trans and non-binary individuals all around the globe. Although I heard that when they did the same issue in countries other than the US, these articles were changed and altered and censored, so that didn't we didn't have the trans joy as much in those other variations of the National Geographic. Teen Vogue, it's going back a little bit, but in 2016 they published an interview with Amanda Stenberg and Harry Neff, who are both discussing their experiences as trans women. And I think more recently in 2020 there was Sports Illustrated, which had a swimsuit issue featuring Valentina Sampaio, and she was the first trans woman to be recognized, you know, by this publication. And I think that was applauded because of its inclusivity and its representation in sports media, which, as you can imagine, is super important these days, because we've seen a real pushback of trans rights and trans inclusion in sport.
Nick, are there any standout pieces of the last few years that really resonate with you?
Yeah, well, I guess I have to talk about Diva, right? So our upcoming issue, I can't say who it is yet, but we do have a very exciting non-binary cover star, and I actually am really proud of a piece that I penned for this upcoming issue. It's all about T for T dating, and it's like I interviewed a range of trans and non-binary people who are in trans for trans relationships and their experiences, and it was just like. Again, there was like room for trans joy, but then we also talk about some more serious stuff there too. And then I remember Cosmopolitan's UK's iconic 50th anniversary issue as well, with Monroe Bergdorf, who was the first trans woman to cover it. And I just really loved that there was like 3 interviewers as well, and they all had like different interests and approach to like the questions that they asked her. And I think it just like covered a lot of really important ground. It
shows that when these things do happen, they actually do resonate, and they can capture a new audience, and they bring in new eyeballs and new fans to a publication that might not have otherwise appealed to them before. So as we close, and we'll start with you, Nick, what simple message would you like editors to take away from today's discussion?
Yeah, well, as we've all discussed, like people who work in the media hold so much power. They can impact how trans people are treated by our families and strangers and those close to us. So please raise our voices, listen to us, and do what you can to make this impact be a positive one.
Fox?
That's beautiful, Nick. I'm not quite sure how I can even add to that, but be an ally. Don't be afraid to share stories of trans lives. Don't be afraid to go there. And when you do go there, consult trans people every step of the way, so that you can future-proof what you're creating. And don't forget that your influence can help people to have that light bulb moment, and that's amazing. You know, that's kind of what you want to do. That's the goal.
Jess?
I think pay attention. I think read the news, and when you read it, sort of question it. And I think look for trans journalists. I think you probably don't have enough. If you're a commissioning editor, you probably don't have enough trans journalists on your radar. Don't be afraid to approach them, but also, if they've pitched you something, then they're probably good enough to have got there in the first place, right? To have got in your inbox and for you to have read their pitch. And whether or not, you take on that pitch or you don't, I think keep them in your little notebook, keep their email address, and don't just assign them, trans writer. I think, keep them for anything that you think that might sort of fall in their wheelhouse.
Amazing. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate you joining us, and I hope people have managed to learn something wonderful there. There's incredible little references there in the chat, which are really good sources for further information. Until then, thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks so much, Cliff, for facilitating the chat. I appreciate that.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much, Cliff. And thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.